Welcome to the Wings Over New Zealand show with Dave Homewood.
Welcome to the Wings Over New Zealand show. My guest today is Wing Commander Bob Henderson. Hi, Bob.
David, how are you?
Good. You were Squadron Commander of Number 40 Squadron in the Gulf War, and we're marking the 30th anniversary on the 17th of January this year of the Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. And so I'd like to get a little bit of the background of that, but to start off with, can you give me a bit of a brief overview of where you came from through the Air Force? Where were you born? Where did you grow up? How did you get into the Air Force? That kind of thing.
Okay. I'm sorry about the noise in the background.
That's right.
So I was born in Marston and went to school at Riyadh College. And quite early on in the piece, my recollection is I think it was my 10th birthday. My father took me for a fly in probably a Cessna 172 at the Wairakei Aero Club.
Okay.
And I thought, hey, this is neat. This is really cool. Flying is something that I get. And my father happened to have flown in the Second World War. I mean, lots of people of his age did. And so I subsequently was looking at how can I have a career flying. Academics at the college took my interest, so that became a question of how can I continue to do tertiary studies. How can I get into flying? Looks like the Air Force is probably a good way to go. It was a growth organisation in those days. The Air Force at that time had recently purchased the Skyhawks, the Orions and the C-130 Hercules, a massive package of re-equipment. And that all happened just as I was finishing secondary school. And I became aware of the fact that the Air Force had a university scheme where they paid you to go to university, fed you, clothed you, and accommodated you, and then gave you a job afterwards. And I went, yeah, that's for me. So that was the pathway I went. So I joined the Air Force University Cadet Scheme and down at University of Canterbury. Came out of that with a Bachelor of Science and then went on to my wings course, so learning to fly. And the course I was on, I think we had a total of 36 pilots and navigators. It was rumoured to be, and as best of my knowledge, it was the largest course since the Second World War. Probably the largest course that the Air Force has ever run. 18 of us graduated, so okay. 17 pilots, one navigator. Of those graduates, 2 of our number have since been Chief of Air Force.
Oh, wow.
So the course quite, in some ways, distinguished itself quite significantly over the time. So end of the course, from the training days down at Wigram, I found myself at a Hakia on the venerable old DC-3 Dakota. So 6 months off the end of a wings course as a young pilot, now sitting in the left-hand seat of a DC-3, flying it all around New Zealand, flying across to Australia, flying up to the Pacific Islands. It was a brilliant start to a career, and certainly taught one to be very independent, and to be very trustful of your own skill sets. I was then lucky enough to get involved in the continuing upgrade of equipment in the Air Force. So the Andover was bought to replace the DC-3.
Yep.
And of course at 42 Squadron we were also doing VIP operations. So we were doing ordinary A to B passenger stuff, we were doing VIP work, and we were also doing parachuting, so static line and supply dropping. So a range of roles. The Andover came along and took over all of those roles. And I was about to move into the left-hand seat of the Andover when I got told, no, you're moving, you're going to Wigram. to take over as responsibility for the NAV training school for, at the time, which was the Little Devon, which was being used for the NAV training.
Right.
While I was there, that was replaced when the Air Force purchased 3 F-27-100s from Air New Zealand and converted them for the NAV role.
Yep.
And so I ended up straight into the left-hand seat of one of those. And the aeroplane was used for the navigation role, but was also used for a VIP and communications role, and then also picked up the maritime patrol for the South Island to take the load off the Orion.
Yep.
So we were doing 7 and 8 hour fishing patrols around the South Island with the aeroplane. So again, a variety of roles. What happened after that? I got qualified as an instructor, and it so happened that the Andover fleet on 42 Squadron was short of an instructor at about the time I finished my training. So basically went straight back to 42 Squadron as a training captain.
Yep.
And then purely by chance became the boss of 42 Squadron because the then commanding officer elected to leave at relatively short notice, took all of his leave and was gone within, I think, 2 weeks of him having given his notice in. So I was the acting CO for a few months while a new person was found.
All right.
And then was asked to set up the VIP flight with the Cessna Golden Eagle at Woodburn. So pilots, engineers and aeroplanes back to Woodburn, and aircraft hadn't been there for 30 years or something, I think. And that was an interesting challenge, moving a flying operation back into the engineering base.
Yeah.
And our primary passengers were the Governor-General, the Prime Minister, and the senior cabinet ministers and the chiefs of defence. So it was very much a corporate air taxi role, which was interesting. And at the end of that, for some reason, the Air Force must have decided that I could do something different. They sent me and my family to the UK for a year to the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell.
Oh, right.
To qualify at the Department of Air Warfare there on a thing called the Aerosystems course. So everyone's familiar with the test pilot course, and the Aerosystems course in the UK and also in Germany and also in the United States is for the second half of the crew of people who learn to operate, fly, and develop a new aircraft type. So routinely a test pilot and an Aerosystems graduate will work together on the introduction of a new aircraft type. Okay. And that course took me, we went to Europe, we went all around the UK, we went to the United States, and it was a great education. And there were, as opposed to just learning aeroplanes, we learned a lot about operational activities, and we learned quite a lot about the plan for defending the inner German border. So we're talking about the late 80s that all of this happened.
Right, right.
Back to New Zealand, a couple of years in Wellington working in air staff, and then I was asked to take over 40 Squadron. So I moved to 40 Squadron at the end of 1990.
Okay.
1989. And end of 1990, of course, we then got involved in Desert Shield. So we sent aeroplanes and people over before Christmas. And then, as you've said, on the 17th of January 1991, Desert Storm started with the first attacks on the Western forces by the Iraqis. And I arrived in theatre on the second night of activities to 5 air raid alerts from Scud attacks coming in from the Euphrates Valley. So we were there, we were sitting in Riyadh city, which is about 2 hours south of the Kuwait border by flight, by C-130, for the duration of the war.
Right. Well, can you take me back to the very point where Iraq invaded Kuwait and the world started to go, we've got to do something about this. You must have been fairly active as the CEO of the squadron working out a plan of what was going to happen. And I seem to recall, I'm not sure of this, but wasn't 75 Squadron going to be deployed and then they changed their mind and decided on 40 Squadron? Is that correct, or was that Air Force rumour at the time? Or
you might think that I couldn't possibly say it. Seriously, my understanding of the situation was, with the invasion of Kuwait, clearly there was a huge level of concern amongst the Western nations, and clearly a lot of that concern was politically based around the surety of supply of oil from the Kuwaiti oil fields, as well as the question of country A being able to just walk across the border and take over a adjoining country. Politically, that's not a good thing to have happen, but a lot of the pressure was clearly around the security of the oil fields. My understanding is that the government looked at how New Zealand might contribute. So whether it might contribute with boots on the ground, whether it might contribute with a frigate in the Gulf, or whether it might contribute with some sort of air power. And on the air power equation, I and the other squadron bosses were aware that the Skyhawks were being looked at, 75 Squadron were being looked at as potential first choice. They had a deployment role. They deployed every year to Singapore, so that we had that capability. And then also I know 5 Squadron with the Orion was looked at, and I mean 5 Squadron have been in that part of the world for a long time, ever since, assisting with surveillance. And my best understanding of the reason the decision was made for it to be a 40 Squadron deployment was the interoperability of the equipment with the allies, with our allies. That's my personal understanding as to why the government decided to send the C-130s rather than the Skyhawk, or rather than the Orion. And it was, as much as anything, just the state of the equipment and the other airplanes at the time. The C-130 in a transport role is in a less lower threat situation in terms of weapons and things. And as long as the airplane has competent communication systems that can integrate with the other forces, then you can use transport airplanes side by side. You don't need necessarily the sorts of data flow information that the Orion and a fighter jet need to be able to transfer information and update each other's screens and all of that sort of level of communication. So I think that's why it fell to 40 Squadron. So very late in the piece, I was called in and basically told, grab someone else that you trust. You've got a week to plan the deployment. The deployment phase was really simple. No, let me rephrase that. The deployment phase was really easy, and that's because since 1965, 40 Squadron have been going to Antarctica on Ice Cube every year for a month, year after year after year, with 2 aeroplanes and all the people. The squadron has a requirement, and always has had a requirement, to be able to deploy 2 aeroplanes and enough people and equipment to operate for 30 days unsupported anywhere around the world on 24 hours notice. That's what Ice Cube practices. And we just went, right, we do Ice Cube, so that's our immediate deployment. We're going to be there for longer than 30 days. So what other engineering and support capability do we need to take with us to be able to operate continuously for how long, bosses? And they said, we don't know, assume 6 months. And so it was an expansion of the Ice Cube plan, not a start from zero.
Right.
And that enabled us to build up the capability, actually, of how to do it quite quickly.
Did that mean that Ice Cube for that summer season was cancelled, or did you also have to do the Ice Cube as well?
No, funny old thing. We were completing the Ice Cube flights. So that summer of 1990, we had been unable to complete all of our flights because of bad weather around McMurdo.
Yep.
And we had got to the point where the ice runway was starting to break up, literally break up. The ice sheet was breaking away from the mainland and drifting away out into McMurdo. We had 3 flights that we were still scheduled to achieve, and we had basically on the last day of our deployment, the weather was such that we decided to launch 3 aeroplanes in trail, 20 minutes apart, turn around on the ice and come back, straight back home to achieve the deployment for the year. As it happened, my aeroplane broke down on the ice. We had a problem with refueling. We ended up having to stay overnight while the engineers fixed the aeroplane. We couldn't get back out again that same evening.
Wow.
So we were helicoptered to and from the aeroplanes because it was unsafe to drive over the ice margin. We had 3 crews, so 18 people sleeping in a bunk room that was designed to sleep 6 because there was a bunk room for 1 crew.
Yep.
And we got out the next morning and we were about halfway home, and we got a call from air traffic services to call Air Force on a certain HF frequency. Of course, 3 aeroplanes all dialed into that frequency. And the message was quite succinct. When you get back to Auckland, go straight to see the boss of flying because you guys are deploying to the Gulf. So it was literally on that flight home that all the negotiations started amongst the pilots and the flight engineers and everybody else as to who was going to go and who was going to stay home.
Okay, wow. That's from one extreme to the other, isn't it? The ice to the desert. Well, that's amazing. So how did you choose, obviously 2 aircraft went in the initial deployment. How did you choose which 2 aircraft? Was there any specific reason for choosing
whichever 2 the engineers could get out of the hangar. No, seriously, the airplanes were going to be away for the maximum amount of time. The aircraft have a calendar servicing cycle on them, plus an hour's servicing cycle. The calendar servicing cycle is the one that stops you.
Yep.
When it's like your warrant of fitness on your car. When you get past that date, you can't keep flying.
Yep.
So the engineers sat down and worked out which airplanes they would put through the hangar now to give them a brand new calendar service cycle to deploy them, and then worked on a replacement plan. So during the whole deployment, I think we had 4 out of the 5 squadron aeroplanes actually in theatre. Okay. So we changed aeroplanes over during the time as well.
All right, okay. And how about, you mentioned about the negotiations started on that flight, but how did you select which crews were going to go, or did it sort of almost become inevitable that everybody would rotate through?
We ended up taking 61 people, I think it was, so 60 plus myself. We initially sent 3 complete aircraft crews. Yep. We sent the sufficient engineers to be able to do 24-hour shifts, so that was round figures, some 20 engineers as well. Yep. We had a small administrative support team, so an administration officer, and office staff. We were told, be self-sufficient. Don't turn up expecting anyone to look after you. You've got to look after yourself. Yep. So we took our own ground loading team with us. We took our own ground security team with us. Right. In terms of the people who are not part of 40 Squadron, so the administration support people, the ground security, the ground loading teams, those were someone else's responsibility to choose. We sat down and talked about making sure you chose people who you could have good trust for and faith in. In terms of 40 Squadron, so the engineers and the air crews, including the flight engineers, everybody volunteered. Let's be open. Everybody volunteered. And it became a case of trying to ensure that we gave everyone an opportunity to serve because they wanted to do so, but removing the high emotional risk part of it, which means those who are newly married or families with expecting children or with very young children at home and those sorts of things. So it was those sorts of emotional filters that we applied to reduce the stress on people, on the individuals, and to reduce stress back here in New Zealand on families.
Right. The squadron had operated, well, actually, New Zealand's last proper involvement in any war would have been Vietnam, wouldn't it? There was nothing in between that was a proper war as such. And the squadron operated in and out of Vietnam as well with the Hercules. So was there anyone still left at that stage in 1990 that had been involved in that last deployment?
No.
I guess.
And very quickly it became evident that the type of operation in Riyadh and in the desert and in the heat and the sand environment was significantly different to the environmental threats in Vietnam, but also the physical military threats. So in Vietnam, the military threats were 1 kilometre outside of the perimeter of your airfield. You had no idea who was there. We were living in, so King Khalid International Airport was the airport we were based at. It is an international airport. It was at the time. Saudi Air was still operating for a period of time. We had all of the New Zealand, Brit, French transport forces all parked at that airport. We had all of the Brit tanker forces parked at that airport. We had a number of the American tanker forces parked at that airport. The other American tanker forces and the AWACS aircraft and other support aircraft were parked at the other airport in Riyadh. Riyadh is a huge city, 2 huge international airports. So the threat was not, the threat was what we would nowadays call the isolated terrorist threat with an IED type thing that we're now all used to in our cities. So we had that threat. But in terms of the threat to the actual operation of the airplanes and everything else, because you could secure the airport, the threat was either being hit by a Scud, by the missiles, and the Scud is a updated Russian version of the old German V2.
Right. Yep.
It's an extended range version of the German V2, literally. Yep. And its accuracy is about half a kilometre radius. It's an area weapon. It's not a point weapon.
Yeah.
But the other threat was that we determined was having flights of Iraqi aircraft, potentially Mirages, coming through at low level and getting through our air defence screens and getting to the airports.
Right.
Because our airports were vulnerable because we had all the airplanes parked up like it was a commercial airport. They were just parked up side, wingtip to wingtip to wingtip. And if you only needed two jets to get through with weapon stores on the wings, and they would have created havoc.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there was a lot of effort in the airborne patrols up by the border to protect the airports south of the border.
Okay, that makes sense. So now you said you arrived just after the actual war kicked off. When did the first crews arrive there? Was it October?
Oh, I should have looked that up before we started.
Yeah, I should have too.
No, it wasn't October because it was after we finished Ice Cube, which basically is the beginning of November.
Oh, right.
So
okay.
My recollection is the first crews were on their way beginning of December. My
Okay.
apologies, I don't have the date in my head.
That's fine. So that's only really a few weeks before you arrived there. That they'd already got there and established themselves. So I just wondered, that period of Desert Shield, was it? I can't really ask you because you hadn't got there earlier, but I wondered if it was much different operating then as it was later. I mean, were they doing a lot of flights? Transporting stuff to places and all that sort of thing during that calm period?
Yes, from our perspective, from the perspective of the RAF Transport Force, which we were part of. So my RAF colleague Peter Bedford, who was also a wing commander, had 5 aeroplanes. I had 2 aeroplanes. So between the 2 of us, we had 7 aircraft, and we very quickly worked out how we would manage those 7 aeroplanes and those 7 crews, given that we were actually under control of different governments.
Right.
So we worked out a system that satisfied everybody and satisfied our Chief of Staff back here in New Zealand, that we were not handing over command and control of New Zealand assets to a foreign power, but meant we could use the aeroplanes really efficiently. And the work of those aeroplanes between Desert Shield and the first month of Desert Storm really didn't change much.
Okay.
So the work was flying on a daily basis out of Riyadh and servicing the forward air bases that the RAF were using, moving people, munitions, equipment, mail, and all those sorts of things to across the forward airfields and along the front line. So flying between as far south as Dubai periodically, but from Bahrain, Dhahran, which is on the coast in from Bahrain, along the Kuwait border to Kasuma, which was the central airport, and again another 10 or 12,000 foot long airport on the border, and then up into the hills to Tabuk, which is where the F-18s were, the F-35s, the stealth fighters were based. Yep. So we were operating right across the extent of the peninsula. The obvious place we did not go to was Jeddah, but Tabuk is up in the mountains just north of Jeddah, and we flew there on an almost daily basis. And so that service of the transport aeroplanes started during Desert Shield and continued during Desert Storm.
Right, okay. What were the living conditions for you guys, the pilots and crew, ground crew?
With the distance of time, it's probably safe to tell the story. Yeah. When the teams arrived up there for Desert Shield, they moved into the airport at King Khalid International, the airport hotel.
Okay. Yep.
Literally on the perimeter of the airport ring road, along with quite a number of the Brit forces and the Brit medics. By the time I got there, and I petitioned our Chief of Air Force, Peter Adamson, to be allowed to deploy over Christmas time, between Christmas and New Year, when it was very obvious that it was likely that a shooting war was going to start. And my petition was just, I'm responsible for these people, I'm putting them in harm's way, I should be prepared to go and look after them.
Yep.
So Peter agreed and sent me up there. By the time I arrived and everyone was starting to get, and more people were being deployed into theatre, what a lot of the Brit forces were doing was moving into the walled compounds within the city. So, what we would consider to be a group of terraced houses, but with a wall around them. And so I arrived into Riyadh, and I think about the second meeting I had when I got there was with a RAF Air Commodore who was responsible. He was a pilot, but he was responsible for administration of the RAF forces in theatre in Riyadh. And we had a discussion about the Kiwi forces moving into a compound. And the short version of the story was, I said, look, sir, we now have a fighting war. There are, people throwing nasty things around. You want my crews to be able to operate their airplanes continuously and at very short notice. And we've already settled into an operational routine. My admin staff have done an absolutely brilliant job, as Kiwis do all around the world. They had negotiated this whole package deal with the hotel.
Yep.
Cheap room rate, cheap food, cheap laundry, everything was percentages and percentages and percentages off.
Yeah.
And by the way, your Brit Tanker Force and your Brit Medics are in this hotel as well. We are 5 minutes from our airplanes. If we go into a compound, we're 45 minutes from our airplanes on a dangerous, unprotected road. We'll stay where we are, thanks. I think this was the first time in the world that this particular RAF Air Commodore had ever been told by a junior officer no. And I have to say, in his defence, we have been the best of friends ever since.
Well, that's good.
So they've been out, he and his wife have been out here to New Zealand and stayed with us. We've stayed with them in the UK because we discovered the following day we're both glider pilots.
Ah, right. Okay. Cool.
And as it turned out, it worked out really well because we were 5 minutes from our aeroplanes. Because we were able to get aeroplanes into the sky really quickly, there's a handful of Iraqi and American ground troops who are alive today because we were able to get aeroplanes to them on the front line really quickly.
Right.
People who had suffered major accidents, and the 90 minutes of golden time to be able to get them to good medical care. We were able to achieve that because we were at the airport.
Right. So, in terms of going out and picking up casualties like that, were you just landed on rough strips or just anywhere, or did they have to get casualties to an airport somewhere, an airstrip?
So our aeroplanes were part of the medevac fleet. So the CASEVAC is the helicopter from the middle of nowhere to a recognised airport. Okay. And then the big transport aircraft is from the recognised airport to the base hospital. And so we were picking people up from Dhahran, which was just south of the Kuwait border on the coast, from Kasuma, which was on the centre of the Kuwait border. Casualties would be moved to those airports either by ground vehicle, but routinely by helicopter. And then we would pick them up from there and fly them back to Riyadh, where they had a major tented hospital erected. The other major hospital in the area was at Bahrain, which was where the New Zealand Army medical team was based.
Right, yeah. So, with you arriving there just as the war had started, what was your first mission? Do you remember your personal first actual operational flight into the war zone?
So one of the advantages of having sent the crews up earlier during Desert Shield was during that time all of the rules about operating this massively diverse group of airplanes between all the way from the Saudis with their Herks and their F-15s and things, the French with all of their equipment, the Brits with their equipment, the Americans with their equipment, all flying the same piece of airspace, was working out the logistics of managing that. So the air traffic control was provided by the American AWACS, sitting over the top.
Yep.
And you would get airborne from your airport, and 10 miles out from the airport, you'd check in with the AWACS. They would log you into their system, and then you go silent. And if they wanted to tell you something, they would talk to you.
Yep.
Otherwise, you just didn't talk to anybody. They were constantly talking to the fast jets, of course. which we couldn't hear because it's all scrambled. So all we hear is that hissing white noise.
Yeah.
The other rules were about using who flew in what directions. It worked out everyone flew at the same speed, and then they created lanes across the peninsula between airports as well. And so arriving in there, flying in on the resupply flight, which took me in there, we flew into Dubai, and we were met in Dubai by one of the airplanes from Riyadh, and their crew plus one of the other captains, who then took over control of our aeroplane to take us into Riyadh, because he said, it's going to be a lot easier if I fly the aeroplane and I'll tell you what's happening as we fly there, rather than trying to explain to you how the system works. It's really easy once you get your head around how it's all been put together, but just trying to sit down with a blackboard and explain it is not easy. So for every time we had new pilots and flight engineers, because they were so integral to the crew, and the navigators arriving in theatre, they would spend 2 days as a supernumerary member of an operating crew flying around, so that it became embedded in their heads how you fly. And the fact that you've got to listen to 5 radios, and any one of those radios may issue you a challenge because you're suddenly in the wrong place, or you've been detected by someone as being a potential threat. And you don't have time to have a conversation. If you're detected as a potential threat, then these are the things that the rules by which you must play, and how you must handle your airplane.
Right.
So every time someone new arrived in theatre, they would spend 2 days being indoctrinated by physically flying around. After that, it was actually all pretty simple, because you never flew in cloud, you stayed clear of the cloud. Behind the front line, we flew at 10,000 feet. Within 10 kilometres of the front line, we flew at 250 feet.
Okay.
We couldn't go below 250 feet because we had helicopters below us. We couldn't go above 500 feet because we had fast jets above us. Right. At night time, on the front line, we flew at 500 feet, just so we had a little bit more of a safety buffer from the terrain underneath.
Right.
And you asked about the evacuation of casualties from the front line. One of the first things we did once I got there was we worked out the pathways across the desert from Kasuma, particularly Kasuma, back to Riyadh to the main base hospital. And we worked out, we found ourselves 3 routes across the open desert, 2 hours long, which we knew we could fly flat out at 500 feet and not be in any risk of running into anything like masts or high tension lines or anything else, so that we could fly those routes 24 hours a day.
Okay. Cool.
Because we figured that if it was going to get serious, then actually we wouldn't have any right to any airspace, because the jets would be just above our tails.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, you're navigating this the old-fashioned way. It was before GPS and all that came in, wasn't it?
Yes, but we had inertial nav systems. So our airplanes had inertial nav platforms, and that was a huge advantage. So the Royal Air Force was still operating on Loran C, which is an area navigation system. Mm-hmm. And it's great for flying from the UK to Cyprus. But once you get to Cyprus, you've got to find some other way of finding your airport, because your Loran C won't take you there. Yeah. So we had the inertial platforms, and that made us very, very valuable, because we could pinpoint our position. So we did do operations into the open desert. I was asked one day to go and pick up a company of rangers who were in the open desert right on the Kuwait border. And we said, where's the airport? And we got told, no, there is no airport. They've got an engineer with them. The engineers found sand which is competent to carry the weight of a C-130. It's 3,000 foot long, it's flat, and this is the coordinates of it. And we went, yeah, okay. And so we flew in, we set ourselves up. We had this conversation on the airplane. of how are we going to validate that this is the right place to put the wheels on the ground? And the answer was all eyes on the flight deck, every crew member standing on the flight deck. Any one person can say, this is the right place, and we will land.
Yeah.
As long as you are absolutely satisfied that what you see confirms that this is the place where we're supposed to be on the surface of the Earth. So we set the Herc up in approach phase, drifting down into the sand, drifting down, drifting down, drifting down. And as I said to everyone, I'm happy to go to within 1 metre of the sand. If no one's called this is the right place by then, we're gone and we go home.
Yeah.
And at about 50 feet, one of my loadmasters shouted, there's a windsock. And we all went, where? And he said, over there. And there's this little black windsock about this long, sitting beside the rock. We're on the ground, landed. We opened the ramp as we were taxiing, as we were landing, as we rolled through. By the time we got to the end of this piece of dirt, or this piece of sand, 50 of these troopers were already climbing up the ramp into the hold of the aeroplane. They were all hiding in the rocks on the edge.
Oh, wow.
By the time we turned around, we said, are they all on board? And their boss said, yes, they're all on board. And we took off and we closed the ramp as we took off.
Wow, that's amazing.
So, and that was the power of the capability that the inertials gave us. We could put the aeroplane or put any load that you wanted on the ground in a pinpoint position.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was great fun.
Now, the Hercs were, well, three of them were 25 years old by that stage, and 2 of them were just a little bit younger. Did they give any trouble in the war zone, or were they quite reliable?
They were extraordinarily reliable, and that was all thanks to the engineering team. The engineers who we detailed off to send up there sat down and they did a risk analysis of what they would be faced with. And they very quickly realised that the one thing they would be faced with, and they talked to their Brit counterparts about this because the Brits are used to operating in the desert.
Yeah.
And they very quickly realised that the one issue they would have to face was the corrosive effect of the sand.
Right.
And the fact that the sand is so fine, some of it's like talcum powder and it gets in everywhere. It gets into all the hydraulic seals, it gets into all of the airports, it gets into everywhere.
Yeah.
And so every day when the aeroplanes came back to Riyadh, we would start at about first aeroplanes, the aeroplanes would both be airborne at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
They would be back in Riyadh about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, crew change, aeroplanes would head off again, and they would keep flying until the work for the day, the package we'd been given to do, was complete, which could be 10 o'clock at night, it could be 4 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
Routinely, it was about midnight. So about midnight, the aeroplanes would get back to Riyadh and be handed over to the engineers, and the engineers then had 4 hours to work on the aeroplanes, and their first priority every single time was to clean them.
Yep.
And so, yes, we had some problems with sand ingestion. We had some problems, a couple of aircraft had problems with loss of airspeed pedostatic type systems, which were transient, but nevertheless, it causes a hiccup at the time. Otherwise, the only time we then discovered we had a problem was months after we got home. So this story is a tangent to answer your point.
Yep.
One of the aircraft that had been in the Gulf was coming back from the United Kingdom on its way from Brize Norton to Washington, Dulles, going to the call on our embassy in Washington. And when the flight engineer was doing his post-flight inspection of the aeroplane, putting it to bed at night at Dulles, he looked up the tailpipe of one of the engines and went, half of the blades are missing on the rear turbine, on the hot turbine. And he went and looked at the other engines. The other engines are all okay. And he went, when did that happen? Went to and said, did you notice anything? And the pilot said, no. So he went back and had a look at his log, paper log, recorded of every 30 minutes of the flight. And about probably 2 hours out from the coast of the USA, he noted that this one engine had drooped in power a little bit, and he just had to push the throttle forward a wee bit.
Yep.
And they decided that that's probably when this turbine partially failed.
Wow.
And the good old bulletproof Herc engine just went, I just need a bit more fuel to generate the power you want.
That's amazing.
So that aeroplane, of course, didn't fly home. We had to fly an engine up to it. They inspected the engine and found that in the turbines and the discs are full of drillings to let airflow through and cool everything down in the centre of the engine. And these holes, the drillings in the discs, were full of glass.
Wow.
So this is from the sand going through the engines with the heat being turned to glass and blocking the breathing holes in the turbines. So all 3 aeroplanes that had been in the Gulf were then inspected. 11 out of 12 engines were changed.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there were some unintended consequences. By the same token, my RAF companion, Peter Bedford, took off from once we were in Kuwait and we were doing battalion changeovers. We would use 5 aeroplanes for 5 hours, and we would change 800 people over on the ground. 1 aeroplane on the ground every 15 minutes, just on a piece of sand. And so you can imagine the dust storm that each aeroplane created. And Peter had the misfortune to have an aeroplane just as he got airborne, full of troops in the back, hauling the aeroplane off the ground as soon as he could to get off the sand, to have the outboard engine on one side decide that it had had enough of this environment and quit.
Yeah.
And he said it was a little bit rough handling for a couple of minutes till he got the aeroplane, a little bit more speed on the aeroplane and got it stable. But it was the same problem. It was just a sand ingestion, damaging the interior of the engine. Yeah.
Gosh. So when you're actually in the war zone there in Riyadh, was there any problem with supply of any parts, or did everything that you needed come up from New Zealand, or could you go to the RAF and say, you know, you guys have got Hercs, can we have this bit off you? How did the parts supply work?
Really, really, really well. We took with us all of those things that you expect to use on a day-by-day basis. So spare radios and seals and hydraulic seals and, you know, all of the things that aeroplanes go through.
Yep.
We also looked at the history of each of the aeroplanes that we took with us and said, this aeroplane for some reason seems to periodically need these pieces replaced. So we took some of those things. And then we were just plugged into the RAF supply line, and the RAF had a TriStar that operated between Lynham and Riyadh every night, an overnight service between Lynham and Riyadh. So if we needed anything, we just went to our RAF supply colleagues and said, we need one of these and one of these and one of these. And they would put it on the TriStar coming out from Lynham that night, and we would have it the next day. Okay. Plus, clearly they had their own stocks there, plus there were American Hercs there as well, who we could always go and borrow things off. Yeah, so all of that worked well. The supply line, because of that TriStar shuttle, the supply line was actually very, very short. It worked really well.
Okay. Oh, cool. Did you get much time to mix with the other nationalities, you know, socially and you know, having a beer with the Brits and the Americans and that on the base?
So there wasn't too much of that sort of social activity. We mingled continuously with the RAF C-130 crews because we were working side by side with them. And because we were living in the same hotel as the RAF VC-10 tanker crews, we got to know them quite well.
Yep.
And so one of the things, and their boss, Group Captain Jeff Simpson, was the base commander as well. So he was a pilot,
Yep.
he was the squadron boss, and he was the base commander. And one of the things that, of course, happened was that the truckies were really rude about the job the tanker pilots' crews had, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so we said, well, actually, let's just show each other what life's like. And we sat down and we agreed that anyone from my team could go fly on the tankers, anyone from the tanker teams could come fly with us for a day. And it was a real eye-opener for both sides.
Yeah.
To go and see what other people were doing and how they did their job. So we worked very, very closely from that perspective. Socialising, there was very little, and that's mainly because we were doing 18-hour days continuously. And the other half of the fact is, of course, Riyadh is a dry country.
Of course, yeah. I hadn't thought about that.
So that had to be respected. The third part of it was that the New Zealand team were well accepted by the locals. I'll tell you a story in a second to prove that. The Brits were accepted. The Americans were not very welcome. And so one of the things very early on in the piece that became evident was when you do go downtown, and the team was allowed to go downtown in their time off, they had to go in groups, look after each other, etc. But make sure you are not, absolutely not mistaken for an American.
Right.
So preferably wear civilian clothes and carry something very obvious that identifies you as a Kiwi, as a New Zealander. And the really obvious one we discovered was the New Zealand flag.
Okay.
Was instantly recognised. And that made a big difference. So there was an active reason why we didn't want to be directly associated with the Americans generally.
Yeah.
Plus they were living in their big camps and things they were in a sort of defended area, if you like. The one bit of socialising we did do, which I was really grateful for, was on a day-by-day basis. Nearly every day I went into town to talk to the New Zealand ambassador. So the New Zealand ambassador and his family and minimal staff stayed on in the New Zealand embassy. And it meant the ambassador and I could compare notes as to what he was being told by the New Zealand government and what I was being told at the morning briefings that I attended that were run by General Schwarzkopf and his team. Yep. And we could figure out where the gaps were. Yep. And especially for New Zealand, pass information back to New Zealand. But the ambassador and his family were very hospitable, and they periodically hosted the team at the embassy.
Okay.
For cocktail hour and things like that. And that, even just being able to do that and go and relax and was very welcome. Everyone was very grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah, right.
But the story about New Zealanders being accepted was, while we were there, of course, Easter came around. Now, you need to remember that the maps of the region produced by the Arab countries do not include Israel. Mm-hmm. Israel does not exist on their maps. It does not exist as a state. Yeah. And Christianity is acknowledged, and if you talking to the Saudis, as they said, the Quran and the Bible both tell the same story. They have different nuances, but the Quran actually mentions the great book, the Bible, 3 times.
Okay.
They tell the same story, but they don't recognize Easter, for example, the same as we don't formally recognize Ramadan. Yeah. So Easter came around while we were there, and I was astonished to walk back into my room at the middle of the day, having done the early shift flying, and in my room in the hotel was a handmade straw basket with hand-painted hard-boiled eggs and a copper script letter which said, "We trust this gift will allow you to celebrate your festival."
Wow.
Every single New Zealander, all 61 people, got that gift.
That's great.
From the hotel staff.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Do I remember correctly that you had a particular mascot with you? One Flight Lieutenant Henry Fanshawe.
Was Henry there?
I think he.
Henry's been to so many places around the world.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure I read in Air Force News that he went on a deployment over there.
He probably did. He probably got mentioned in dispatches.
Yeah. No idea.
He wasn't with my crew, so he may well have been with one of the other crews. There were 4 crews, and we kept the crews together as integral units. It wouldn't have surprised me if Henry was there. His name's probably on one of the lists somewhere.
Yeah. For those watching or listening that don't know Henry, he's a very well-known teddy bear in the Air Force and wears a flying suit, and he's got lots of medals, and he's been all over the place.
He's been everywhere, literally.
Yeah, and on all the squadrons.
Yeah.
And he's now in the Air Force Museum. But in terms of taking other people on, did you have any journalists go with you or anything like that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we had, partway through the deployment, we had a New Zealand media team arrive into theatre with a defence PR person as their minder. And so there was TV One, Radio New Zealand, a Herald reporter. I'm not going to remember them all. I'm sorry. My apologies to them. Yeah. And they were sent up to have a look at what we were doing and report back to New Zealand. They were very quickly indoctrinated by our Army PR person, plus I think it might have been one of the PR people from General Schwarzkopf's team.
Oh, yes.
That they were allowed to take photographs and video. They had to submit the photographs and the video for inspection, purely as a way of protecting the journalists, as opposed to not trusting the journalists. They were allowed to talk to people. They were allowed to record interviews. The one thing they were not allowed to do was identify where they were on the surface of the earth.
Okay.
Apart from the fact they were in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, yes.
So the physical location of the imagery was the piece that was not allowed to be made public.
Right. Gotcha.
So the media team turned up and they arrived into Riyadh. And the first thing when I sat down with them was they said, "We're surprised we're here. We were told you were in Oman." Well, we're not. We're in Riyadh. And by the way, we're flying to within a couple of kilometres of the front line every day. And they went, "No, you're not. Nah, stop pulling our legs." And I said, "Okay, as long as you absolutely understand the rules about identifying the place that you are taking photographs of, you're going on the aeroplane first thing tomorrow morning with Captain Dave Wake." And sat Dave down and said, "Dave, just make sure these guys understand how serious this is and what we're doing." And so Dave went with them on the morning flight, which was out to the coast of Bahrain, then Dubai, then Dhahran, and then along the pipeline to Kasuma, along the border. And Dave took them along the border at 250 feet, with the ramp open, with the TV team and all the rest of it in the ramp. And they flew across all of the camps that were out in the open desert as all the troops were building up their encampments on the outer open desert, 5 clicks short of the front line.
Yeah.
The video made its way straight back to New Zealand because it didn't identify where they were.
Yeah.
But the media turned up back to our location in the early afternoon after this was all over, and like this. And the message was, we were not told you were doing anything like that. And I said, that's what we're doing every day. So the next time that was really, really funny, and unfortunately it got me offside with my wife back here because the video turned up here, and my daughters saw it. And we were out at the airport, myself and Dave Forbes-Dawson, my number 2, with the media team, and we were looking around the airport and looking at security arrangements and things, like my recollection, just a general tour. And we were caught out in the middle of the airport by an air raid with a scud attack.
Okay.
And so we went, well, we're too far away from the terminal to get back to the terminal to do anything. So we just parked ourselves up under a overpass with a taxiway over the top. Yeah. And they had masks and everything. And they said, do we have to put all this on? I said, no, just put your masks on, the Darth Vader hoods. Yeah. That's sufficient protection. If it looks really bad, you'll have time to climb into the chemical suit, but the Darth Vader hood's 98% of your protection. Yeah. So then we got the all clear, which we figured we would get because the alert came from the French sector, not from the British sector. And so then they stuck me on camera, and without thinking about it said, what's the worst thing that could have happened? And I just looked straight down the bore of the camera and said, we could have been killed. And the face on the other side of the camera went. So, yeah, I mean, that was very tongue-in-cheek because there wasn't actually an attack at Riyadh. The attack, the missile went somewhere else, and it was fairly obvious to us that it was going somewhere else. So the media team became very useful sources of messaging for us back to New Zealand once they realised how seriously we were involved. Yeah.
Yeah, I think New Zealand, pretty much all of New Zealand was following the war, but we didn't see much of what the New Zealanders were doing. We saw, mainly the CNN feed, which was showing what the Americans were doing in the war. And even so, I know that us in the Air Force, we were, aware that it was dangerous and all that sort of thing. I don't really know if the general public really thought much about it though. Did you ever get a sense of what was going on back here at that time or afterwards?
We gained an awareness when this media team arrived that the New Zealand public weren't quite aware of the fact that we were operating out of Riyadh and that we were operating right up on the front line. I think the imagery they sent back to New Zealand helped to dispel that incorrect information. And I think the contribution that we made in terms of being in the intimately involved became reasonably well known. I mean, we never got around to talking about how many tons of equipment we moved, what percentage of the RAF in theatre lift we did. Those were all the sorts of metrics we were measuring ourselves by. Just the fact that we were able to be there, we were able to contribute, we were able to do everything that was asked of us. And we knew that if the RAF planners had something difficult or slightly more demanding that they needed from their transport force, their first option was to pick up the phone and ask us to do it.
Okay.
Which is what our objective was. We need to prove we can pull our weight here. And that really helped.
Wow.
I think one of the other things that helped as well, purely by happenstance, was that you remember I said that I got sent to, or my family got sent to RAF Cranwell to do this Aero Systems course.
Yes.
And part of that course included operational studies. Part of the operational studies included the battle plan for the protection of the Indo-German border should the Russians roll across the border. And there were 24 of us on that course, 18 Brits and 6 foreigners. And of the 18 Brits who were on the course and myself, 12 of us were directly involved in Gulf War I.
Okay. Wow.
So some of my Brit colleagues were in theatre. I knew they were there. We finally managed to figure out that we were each there.
Yep.
Some of them were involved in aircraft modifications. Some of them were involved in headquarters. And so we knew we were each there. But for me, it made it really simple when I first turned up and was talking to the senior British officers to say, by the way, I'm an Aerosystems graduate. I'm looking around here, what I see is the battle plan for the inner German border moved to the Saudi desert. And they went, you'd be pretty right about that. And I said, so I think I get what the general plan is.
Yeah.
Now tell me where I'm mistaken. Because that was the building block of the way the system was set up in Saudi, was to take that inner German border model, move it to the desert, and then say, right, how do we now modify this?
Yep.
And so it made it really easy for me to be able to walk in there and say, I understand this battle plan because I've studied it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it also proves how important these exchanges and inter-cooperation between air forces is.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it just means that you can walk into someone else's place and say, yeah, I pretty much understand what it is you're trying to do and how you want to go about doing it. So let's figure out how we can work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of the questions that I had when this whole thing started with Operation Desert Shield, I was at number 1 Technical Training School at Hobsonville doing my safety and surface course. Being safety and surface, we painted aircraft, and one of the things that we were all thinking is, oh, are they going to paint the Hercs into the desert pink, because everything else was getting painted desert pink over there. And was there ever any consideration of that?
There was no time.
No.
And it's a hideous colour.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it worked on some aircraft, but on the Hercs, I don't know. It's I think was it the Brits or the Americans painted some of them that colour, and it just, it didn't look right.
No, I mean, camouflaging an aeroplane is a difficult thing to do anyway. And, particularly given we're flying across the desert and then you're flying across green areas and then over the water, one camouflage doesn't work for everything. So it's
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yes. In the end, with something like a C-130, you're still better off hiding the aeroplane by using the terrain to hide behind, rather than trying to just blend into it.
Yep. Okay. So the war itself didn't really last as long as what a lot of people expected. Was it end of February or 23rd of February? I think that finished. I can't remember now.
No, neither can I instantly. It lasted longer than we thought it would from our perspective.
Okay.
So the original sort of briefings were from Schwarzkopf that his ambition was to reduce the capability of the Iraqi ground forces to about 50%.
Yep.
Before he put any boots on the ground. He was prepared to sacrifice aeroplanes to protect the vast majority of the people under his command, which were the troops. Because once you started, the concern being once you started a ground combat in that sort of environment, you could have casualties mounting up extraordinarily quickly.
Yep.
And given the threat scenarios that were being posed to us, which included chemical weapons, and I know there's a huge debate out there, there were chemical artillery shells out there on the battlefield. We brought some Iraqi casualties back from the front line who were injured by their own shells exploding. So they were there, small chemicals, but they were there. So Schwarzkopf's intention was to reduce the ground force capability by 50%. And then what he was not prepared to do was move until his reconnaissance intelligence people had proven to him that they had achieved that figure. And that starts to become difficult when you understand that the Iraqis were using smart techniques like having plywood tanks on the ground.
Yep.
Yeah, where's that come from? I think the Brits did that, didn't they?
They did, yep, exactly. Even the RNZAF did that. We had plywood airplanes on our.
Right.
Yeah.
And trying to ensure that you've knocked out aircraft, trying to ensure that you've knocked out runways, trying to ensure you've knocked out hangars, and even the Scuds. The Scuds were a real weapon of nuisance. They were on their mobile launchers. They were in the Euphrates River Valley, hidden amongst all the trees. They could deploy to a firing position, fire, and be gone before the airborne F-16s who were designated to attack them could get to the position where they'd been fired from.
Yes.
And so trying to even just reduce the number of Scud launches to reduce that threat. And so it became, the air war became somewhat of a war of attrition, just while they were doing their best to ensure that capability had been reduced. But one of the things that I think in the end triggered the start of the ground war wasn't so much the attrition of the ground forces by air activity, it was the attrition of the ground forces by PR activity. You talked about seeing imagery from CNN of the American ground troops out in the desert with all their gear on in 40-degree temperatures, running across the open desert. You can do that for about 10 minutes. The TV camera is wonderful because you take 8 minutes worth of video and use 6 minutes. You know? Who was the American reporter? Arnett was sitting in a hotel in Baghdad, and the CNN coverage was being beamed to Baghdad. The CNN coverage was being beamed into Iraq. And so the assumption was made that a percentage of the Iraqi people and a percentage of the Iraqi armed forces would be seeing this imagery. Whether they were permitted to or not is a different question, but they would be seeing it. And they would be seeing these troops fully kitted up with 60 kilos on their backs in Darth Vader hoods and chemical suits, sprinting across the desert. And the Iraqis would be looking at their own equipment, and most of the equipment they had that I saw once we got into Kuwait and got into Kuwait City was circa 1918. So the level of protection that they were provided was dramatically less than the protections and capabilities that we had. And so that combined with the B-52s every night walking along the front line, dropping 500-pound bombs into the sand. They caused absolutely no damage. But I watched them one night. It was really impressive. This line of B-52s and this wall of fire walking across the sand, because the Iraqis were in bunkers 40 feet down. So all that they knew was they had to take shelter in their bunkers, because at this time of night, the B-52s would turn up and they would bomb their front line trenches. And then the next night, the B-52s would turn up and they would drop this, all these leaflets. And the leaflets were cartoons. And the cartoons were Iraqi soldiers in their trench, Iraqi soldiers in their trench looking at the time, Iraqi soldiers in their running to their bunkers as a B-52 appears, and then explosions in the desert. And the message was same time tomorrow night. And so we got to the point where there were thousands of Iraqi troops every morning, just after dawn, would walk across the front line to surrender.
Amazing.
And so the front line troops were surrendered. They were walking across the front line to surrender to the American forces.
That's amazing. The power of propaganda, isn't it?
Yep.
It worked. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think a lot of people thought that having CNN and maybe the BBC and others continually showing the war right through the day was a bad thing for those in the front line. But hearing that, it actually sounds completely the opposite.
Well, I absolutely understand that there can be an extraordinarily bad side of that sort of PR, and the imagery we all saw from Vietnam, and of some of the things that happened in Vietnam, and some of the atrocities and the use of napalm, and some of the atrocities in the villages and things. You put that on in front of your own public, and you create huge anxiety and huge anger. Now, we weren't showing casualties, we weren't showing that sort of imagery. The imagery was of troops training to fight, not physically fighting. When the ground war actually started, we got a hint that it was going to start, and then we were told in the morning it was on, and we were then the next day. One of the interesting things was the next day we were asked to prep our Hercs to airdrop into the Kuwait desert behind the frontline tanks, because the tanks had outdriven their supply columns, and they needed fuel, particularly fuel and water. And so we were in the process of loading our Hercs to go and drop this stuff into the desert, and I had permission to do it. We had organised all of that beforehand. We had the capability to do that if we needed to, and we were called off at the last minute. Some of the supply columns caught up with the tanks again, but the tanks drove across the open desert at 60 kilometres an hour for 12 hours.
Wow!
Just flat out, and right up into Iraq, and then curved back around from the northwest into the northwestern corner of Kuwait behind the Iraqis.
Okay. Wow. That's pretty incredible.
So that really was, that really softened up the Iraqi resistance in that first 24 hours very, very quickly. And they abandoned Kuwait City very quickly, very soon after that.
Right. So what are your memories of the actual end of the war then, and everything coming to an end?
It was, I mean, the workload just continued on. So once the ground war started, we started flying, as I said, these flights, doing a battalion changeover in the Kuwait desert, just out in the open desert. We would take 800 men and their equipment in, bring 800 people out. With a fleet of Hercs, and we were doing that day after day after day. And then once the Iraqis capitulated, we had the interesting challenge of being able then to get into Kuwait City, because the General Tapita de Villiers was given the task of setting up all of the peace talks and everything, the Brit General. And the Brit ambassador also wished to go back to Kuwait. So Peter Bedford and I sat down, and we literally tossed a coin to see who was going to take the general to start the peace talks, and the ambassador take him home. Peter won and got to take the ambassador home. I took de Villiers in to start the peace talks. But Peter came back from taking the ambassador home to say, we have a problem. Kuwait City is under this pall of oil smoke, and we have had an extremely difficult job finding the airport. And so we then had to work out a way of getting ourselves into Kuwait International Airport, because we needed to operate in and out of there. I tried it the other way the next day with the general on board. We went in underneath the smoke. and we got there, but that wasn't that pleasant either. It was uncomfortable.
Yep.
So we had to work out a way of being able to safely get aeroplanes in and out of Kuwait City, which we did. And then after that, it was really a case of just what do we need to do to tidy everything up, and then start negotiating to get ourselves home.
Right.
And so one of the interesting things was, because we had resupply flights, we now have more equipment in theatre and people than we could get home on 2 aeroplanes.
Right.
So that's why the RAF TriStar arrived at Whenuapai with us.
Right. Yeah.
Because the Brits went, we're happy to support you. We'll support you getting home. We'll provide you with an aeroplane to help get everyone and all your equipment home. But that took some time to negotiate. Actually getting diplomatic clearances to get the aeroplanes home took some time to negotiate, because no one in the Indian Ocean would let us land.
Oh, okay.
Because we've been fighting on the other side.
Right. Wow.
So we flew from Oman around the bottom of India and to Christmas Island.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. With the Herks to get home. So all those sorts of little things about actually getting home. And then the other one was to Singapore, and then down to Christmas. The other one was just once you took the lid off everybody in the theatre, and they all went, and then started to think about some of the stress they've been under, some of the threats they've been exposed to.
Yeah.
And so became an issue of just looking after all of the people as they started to wind down a little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
And all their individual reactions. Everyone had done an absolutely brilliant job. Everyone had been really focused on their jobs and looking after each other and making sure that we did a really good job. And once you took that pressure off, then people had the chance to go, hey, suddenly I don't feel quite so happy.
Yeah.
Normal reaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Has there been any problems down the track from any of your team with PTSD or anything like that? Or
look, to the very best of my knowledge, no. We had the team of Defence Psychs flew up to Brisbane, up to Amberley to meet us on our way home. And so I have the advantage or disadvantage of having psychology degrees myself. And so once we were safely able to start heading home, I was able to turn my mind to looking after those people who clearly were having some stress reactions.
yes.
And so when we got to Amberley and the Air Force Psych team arrived to help, I was able to sit down with them and say, so these are the people I want you to talk to first, and this is what I'm seeing. But clearly you are going to want to talk to everybody, but these are the priorities. And handed them over to Kevin and the team.
Yeah.
To the very best of my knowledge, because everyone looked after each other so well, there haven't been any long-term effects.
That's great. That's excellent.
I mean, we're also very, very fortunate that we had one person who was injured in a motor vehicle accident, which was really unfortunate. And he was flown out to the UK and then flown home. But we didn't have some of the issues that my colleagues in the RAF had with their friends being killed.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anyone in the RAF who was actually killed in combat, but a couple of colleagues of my course mates were killed. And when I had the chance to go back to the UK later in 1991 with my family and caught up with my course mates, they were really rattled by the fact that you have, and this is a normal reaction, you have a conflict that turns into an armed conflict, there is always the risk that people will be injured or killed. And no one wants that to be themselves, and no one wants that to be their friend. And everyone's really happy to come home and to come home uninjured. But when one person out of 100 whom you happen to know doesn't come home, there's quite a severe reaction to that as to why wasn't he able to come home? You know, the converse of that is when 90 out of 100 people are killed, the 10 people who survive will routinely have the response, why wasn't I killed with them? So humans do this, and so our RAF friends had this reaction of, how come we're all okay and this one person, our friend, did not come home? And that was really tough on them, and they were really hurting.
It's sad. I do remember the motor vehicle accident that you mentioned. That I know that rattled the Air Force when that happened. You know, us back home. But as you say, there was nobody in our team were killed. So fantastic result, really. To go to war and all come home.
Look, and the motor vehicle accident is one of those almost predictable ones when you are working in an environment where everyone is significantly fatigued because of the hours you've been doing. When you're driving on the wrong side of the road with the steering wheel on the wrong side of the car, and you're turning into a safe place, i.e. turning into the entrance to your accommodation, and you just automatically look the wrong way down the road because that's the way you always look down the road, and that's all that happened.
Wow.
It was, you know, the same thing happens routinely to tourists driving in other countries, but and that's all it was. It was purely an accident, absolutely an accident, and just so tragic that we had it happen.
So, at what point did you come home? You said you were there till Easter, so were you there much longer than that?
So it was 85 days. So what's that? For January, February, March. It was April. Again, I haven't looked up the date in my diary. So
that's fine. So sort of late April sort of thing. You came back to New Zealand and arrived back. And did you just have to get back on to normal work, or did you have any leave, or what happened?
What did we do? I vaguely remember I was required to write an extensive report, which took me. Everyone that had been away, of course, was given the opportunity to take leave, take some time off, get out back with their families and things. The families had looked after each other really well back here in New Zealand, including the families from the Army medical team. So the Air Force and the Army families had all gotten together and supported each other and everything, and all of that had worked well. I honestly don't remember what I did. It was pretty much a whirl because I had to do debriefings, write reports and things. I think for me, the one cathartic activity once I was home was having the chance to put together a presentation about this is who we were and this is what we did, and have the opportunity to go around and actually give that presentation to people to explain what we'd done, and for that to be really well received. I was amazed at how well it was received, that people wanted to know what we'd done and hear about our activities.
Yeah, well, I remember you brought that to Wigram. I was based there by then, and it was sometime in 1991, I guess. And it was a slideshow, wasn't it? A slide presentation. Lots and lots of photos that you'd taken there, and it was fantastic. It was really interesting it was a packed house as well. And it was just really, really interesting for us who had been following it through the news and following it through all the Air Force gossip. But to actually see the photos of what was really going on and what it was really like was fantastic. And I definitely appreciated that. It was great.
Of course, you realise all those photographs were illegal.
Yeah, I can just imagine they would have been.
We asked about that when we got there, and we were told that technically you should not be taking photographs in the kingdom.
Yeah.
Practically, no one's going to stop you taking a photograph as long as you are respectful. So don't go around photographing the inside of mosques.
Yeah.
And don't go photographing people.
Right.
So just general tourist photographs or photographs of what you are doing and your activities.
Yes.
Okay, but be respectful of the inhabitants of the kingdom, and be respectful of their culture.
Yeah.
And so and that was the line that we worked on, and that was okay. And so the photographs were being developed in Riyadh, and we knew that they were. We worked on the assumption that any time you sent photographs in to be developed, that someone would have a look at them.
Yes. Yeah.
And so be very careful. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
Mm.
It's great that you decided to do that and make that record, because I don't think we had an official Air Force photographer there, did we? It was really just you guys with the cameras.
It was just partly for that reason. Yeah.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Now, I seem to recall that later in 1991, there was an air show in England. I think maybe, was it the Royal International Air Tattoo or one of those air shows, and a Hercules went over. It was a big sort of after the war air show. Did you go up for that? One of our Herks went up for that.
So I did 3 trips to the UK with the Herks. One of them was to take a helicopter over there for a helicopter.
Helimeet, yeah, that was 89, I think.
Yeah. So no, I didn't. I was invited back to the UK for a debriefing.
Okay. Yeah.
Post Desert Storm.
Yeah.
And so we went back. The chief gave permission for my family to go with me. We went back for a debriefing over there, and we went to dinner at Lynham, formal dinner at Lynham and things. So that was
okay. Cool.
And of course, we still have my course colleagues in the UK, and we still have contacts with people in the UK as a result of all of this that we routinely see and talk to.
Yeah, yeah. I wondered about that particular air show with our Hercules there, because I do remember that there was a collision between 2 MiGs, and one of them just about landed on our aircraft. If you remember that.
Yeah, no. So I remember the air show now. I know I was not there.
You wasn't there. Well, that's good. Yeah. No, this has just been fascinating. So what happened after, how long were you with the squadron? You'd only been there for a year. So did you continue on for a while, or with the squadron?
Yeah, I stayed with the squadron till early 1993. So I did a 3 years, just over 3 years as squadron boss.
Yep.
And then my wife and I decided that the time was appropriate to look at establishing another career.
Yep.
And part of the reason behind that decision was the stovepipe in the Air Force, once you started getting into the senior ranks, becomes quite narrow quite quickly.
Yes.
So we, along with a couple of my colleagues at the time, we elected to move outwards. And I actually had myself a job teaching at the University of Auckland in the psychology department.
All right.
I ended up being invited to become an instructor on the simulators at Air New Zealand.
Oh, right. Okay.
So we left the Air Force with no intention of pursuing a flying role or a flying job,
yep.
and ended up, because this door opened, having the opportunity to join Air New Zealand and become involved with this. So then ended up with me on the 737 and then the A320 with Air New Zealand for the next just over 20 years.
Right. Oh, right. Okay.
So we retired from Air New Zealand, left Air New Zealand just over 3 years ago now.
Okay. Yep. So you're completely retired now?
No. Just reducing the level of work.
Right. Right. And you're also quite an avid glider pilot, aren't you? So tell me about your gliding.
Okay, so yes, I've been gliding since 1975, and got involved in gliding competitions as a way of enjoying the sport,
yep.
Which led to 1995, me being the Director of Operations for the World Gliding Championships at Omarama, so one of 5 directors that ran that activity. As a result of meeting all of the international people involved with that activity, I got invited to assist the French in 1997 to run the World Championships in Saint-Aubin in Provence, southern France. And that led me into being involved in the international gliding community from about 1999, initially as a member of the protest jury. Think of it the same as the protest jury for America's Cup.
Yep.
Exactly the same sort of role. So we did that. I think we went to 8 or 9 international competitions over about the next 5 or 6 years, and then involved in the politics of the organisation, the International Gliding Federation. And then for the last 10 years, I've been on the board of the World Air Sports Federation. So I've just stood down from the presidency of that organisation.
Okay, wow. That's quite a career.
And to answer your question, when did I last fly a glider? In South Africa in 2011.
Okay, it's been a while.
It's quite some time since I've actually had a glider attached to me.
But what about powered flight? Have you done any recreational powered flight?
Very little. Towing for gliders, so with Piper Cubs and such like, and a little bit of microlight flying.
Okay.
But yeah, that's all.
All right. Okay. So you don't miss flying too much?
The reality is I've never just been a pilot. Over 20 years with the Air Force, 20 years with Air New Zealand. My time in the Air Force, of those, not counting wings course and ground courses and things like that, I probably spent about 9 months sitting in the right-hand seat.
Yep.
Somewhere between 9 months and 12 months sitting in the right-hand seat of an aeroplane. The rest of my time in the Air Force was on the left-hand seat, and as an instructor or in a management role on a squadron of some sort. And then with the airline, I spent a long time in the right-hand seat because of the way the airline structure works before I gained my command. But even when I was in the right-hand seat in the airline, I was working as a human factors instructor, CRM instructor, and working in teaching and managerial roles as well.
Okay.
So the same is true with the airline. I think the real answer to your question is the most enjoyable job I've ever had was that 3 years with 40 Squadron.
Okay.
Where I did my share of flying. I certainly didn't steal the trips, but I made sure I kept myself current in all of the roles that the aeroplane had.
Yep.
And sufficiently current to be able to take an aeroplane somewhere around the world if I needed to, or make sure I had a really highly qualified navigator to look after me. And then the rest of the time was looking after the 80 aircrew and 80 engineers that were all part of the squadron.
Okay.
And so the flying was the bit where I could go throw an airplane around, but actually the piece of work I really enjoyed was the looking after the people. So 40 Squadron was for me the ideal job.
Yeah. Did you think back then that 30 years later they'd still be flying the same aircraft and they're approaching 60?
When we came back from the United Kingdom, I spent just under 2 years working in Wellington, and I was the director of planning in Wellington for the air staff. One of the roles I had there was to assist with the negotiation of the contract for number 2 Squadron to go to Nowra, which I claim is a success. It was a 5-year contract, lasted for 15 years.
Yeah, it's great.
One of the other projects that I had was to look at the replacement of the Air Force fixed wing fleet. And so in 1988, I think it was, we recommended that all of the current fixed wing airplanes be replaced by 8 C-130Js.
Okay, interesting.
It's finally almost happened.
I wonder how many other people down there have made the same recommendation year by year.
Quite a few, I would think, quite a few.
Exactly.
It's really hard to replace a Herc with anything other than a Herc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's a wonderful workhorse of an airplane. It's really versatile, and there's nothing else that's been built that just has the range of capabilities that you can plug a Herc into. Yeah.
Do you keep in touch with the squadron? Do you go to reunions or anything like that?
I keep in a degree of contact with the squadron, and I'm supposed to be speaking at a squadron dining in 2 weeks' time at Whanaupai. It was supposed to be last year. COVID got in the road.
Yeah.
So yes, periodically go back to the squadron. Of course, most of the faces have changed and things, but we just keep in contact. And of course, a lot of the people that I flew with when I was at the squadron were subsequently with me in Air New Zealand.
Right.
That's been quite a normal progression for people. So keep in touch with the people through that avenue as well.
Yeah, of course, of course. One last question, I guess. Did you have a favourite Herc of the fleet of 5? Was there a favourite?
I was going to say there was one that was a bit of a hanger queen, and I can't remember the number, but no. I mean, they all performed the same. As I say, the airplane's just a great workhorse. It's not the nicest airplane to fly. Don't get me wrong. It's actually quite hard work to fly, but it's just such a great workhorse. You can do so much with it, and it's such a faithful airplane. So.
Do you think they're probably easier to fly now that they've been upgraded with all the, new cockpit in them, or is it still just as hard?
So the airframe itself hasn't changed, and that's the bit that's hard. The electronic flight deck makes it a bit easier, and I've flown the simulator. So I've flown the simulator they have for it.
Yes.
Because the presentation of information is all gathered onto that single central instrument for the pilot.
Yep.
Which is the same as the electric jets, the same as the modern Boeings and the Airbuses. All of the information you need to be able to fly the airplane is gathered onto that single central instrument.
Okay.
And so it makes it much easier from that perspective to work the airplane.
Yeah.
But then, of course, when that instrument dies, life gets really difficult. Because now you're having to use all these old techniques that you've completely forgotten about, called radial scan and things.
Yeah. No, brilliant. Thank you very much, Bob. It's been a fascinating talk with you, and really, I've learned a hell of a lot about what happened over there, and I really appreciate it. And I think this is a great way to celebrate the 30th anniversary of what you guys did over there. And thank you very much for your service as well.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the chance to share. It's as you can hear from it was a fascinating experience, and I think for a serviceman to have the opportunity to actually seriously go and practice what they've trained for, and to discover that you can do it moderately well is invaluable, because otherwise all you're ever doing is training. You have no idea whether how good you're going to be. So, and that wasn't just me, that was the whole squadron. I mean, we came home from Gulf War I, and we won the Bullseye Trophy for the next 2 years. That was all because of the experience that the team that went to Bullseye had gained operating, flying the aeroplanes and working operationally.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just having that confidence that we can do this.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, you made us proud. That's for sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, Dave. My pleasure.
That was the Wings Over New Zealand show with Dave Homewood.